Picture this. It's late at night in New York City, September 26, 1983. You wake up, grab your phone, and start mindlessly scrolling through notifications. But that night almost never existed, because thousands of miles away, deep inside a Soviet underground bunker, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov was staring at a radar screen that suddenly lit up with a terrifying message. The computers were reporting that several American nuclear missiles had just been launched toward the Soviet Union. Sirens, alarms, flashing lights. Everything in that room was screaming one message: missile launch detected, confirmed. According to the rules of the system, that meant only one thing: the Soviets should immediately launch a full nuclear retaliation. Within minutes, the world could have gone from a tense Cold War to a nuclear firestorm that wiped out New York, Moscow, and most of the planet. With a single phone call, Stanislav Petrov could have helped burn the world down. But he didn't. He looked at the data, thought about it, and said to himself, "This doesn't make sense. If the US were really attacking, they wouldn't launch just a few missiles. The machine might be wrong." And he made a choice. He did not report it as a confirmed attack. Later, it turned out he was right. It was a false alarm, a glitch. You are alive today, watching this video, at least partly because one Soviet officer decided not to trust a computer. So before you swipe away to the next video, give this one a chance. Don't judge it on the first 30 seconds. Because in this story, we're going to see how a country that began as a dream of a worker's paradise became America's worst nightmare, the Soviet Union, and how that system suddenly collapsed and helped create the world you're living in right now. And at the very end, I'm going to ask you one simple question that will force you to decide. Would you have been able to live inside that system, or would you have ended up in the streets demanding your freedom? If you grew up in the United States, you've heard a very clear picture your whole life. America equals freedom, democracy, choice, prosperity, everything from free speech to fast food. The Soviet Union equals gray apartment blocks, empty shelves, endless lines, spies, and nuclear missiles pointed at your city. But to understand what the Soviet Union really was, we have to go back to a very different country, Tsarist Russia. No president, no constitution like America's, just a czar, an absolute ruler. A tiny elite around him was incredibly rich. Tens of millions of peasants lived in harsh poverty. Corruption ran from top to bottom, and the country was being torn apart by World War I. You might be sitting somewhere in New Jersey, Texas, or California asking, why should I care about Russia in 1917? Because what happened that year gave the world for the first time a serious alternative to capitalism: communism. On one side, you had the American idea: free markets, private property, competition. If you're smart and hardworking, you rise up. On the other side, a totally different promise appeared. All factories, land, and banks should belong to everyone collectively. No bosses, no landlords, no billionaires. Everyone works, everyone shares. That clash between capitalism and communism shaped American elections, American foreign policy, and even your tax bill for most of the 20th century. Right before the revolution, Russia was in crisis. The Tsar was on the throne, but totally out of touch. The cities were bursting with angry workers. The countryside was full of peasants, still living almost like serfs. World War I was destroying the economy. Russian soldiers were dying by the millions, often without enough food, boots, or ammunition. Back home, people were cold, hungry, and furious. In early 1917, protests and strikes exploded. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. That was the February Revolution. A temporary government took over, promised change, but kept Russia in the war. It wasn't enough. In October of that same year, a radical group led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks, seized power in the name of the workers and peasants, promising peace, land, and bread. If you're American, you can think of it as a kind of upside-down version of your own revolution. In 1776, Americans said, "No king, we'll rule through elected representatives." In 1917, the Bolsheviks said, "No king, no capitalists. The working class will rule through one party, ours." By 1922, this new state had a name: the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. On paper, it sounded like a moral upgrade. No poverty, no unemployment, no exploitation, just equality and shared ownership. But dreams are one thing, building a system around them is another. To protect this revolution, the new Soviet leadership built a state that did not tolerate opposition. If you spoke too loudly against the government, you could get a knock on your door in the middle of the night and simply vanish into prisons or labor camps. A country that called itself a workers' state was already starting to look like a police state. At first, under Lenin, there was actually some economic flexibility. He introduced the new economic policy, which allowed a bit of private trade and small businesses. Peasants could sell their crops at markets. It was a tactical retreat to stabilize the country after civil war. But Lenin died young, and a brutal power struggle followed. The man who came out on top was Joseph Stalin. In more than 200 years of U.S. history, no president has ever had the kind of total, unchecked power over American life that Stalin had over the Soviet Union. Stalin's goal was to transform the USSR from a poor, mostly agricultural country into an industrial superpower that could stand up to and maybe defeat the capitalist West. His method was ruthless. The state took control of factories, mines, and major industries. Planners in Moscow drew up 5-year plans that set production targets for steel, coal, oil, and almost everything else. On paper, it was rational, scientific planning. In practice, it often ignored what ordinary people needed and wanted.
One of the harshest policies was collectivization. Millions of peasants were forced to give up their private land and animals and work instead on giant collective farms run by the state. Those who resisted were labeled enemies of the people, kulaks. Many were arrested, deported to remote regions like Siberia, or sent to forced labor camps known as gulags. Some were executed. In Ukraine, terrible mistakes and brutal grain requisitions helped create a man-made famine known as the Holodomor. Millions starved to death, while official reports bragged that grain quotas were being met. If you're sitting today in a Starbucks or a living room somewhere in the US, it might feel impossible that a modern government could inflict that kind of suffering on its own people. But when a system tells itself, "We cannot be wrong," then anyone who points to reality becomes a threat. To enforce its version of reality, the regime built a vast secret police network. People disappeared in the night. Their families were often too afraid to ask what had happened. And yet, at the very same time, enormous dams, power plants, and steel mills were being built. The USSR was industrializing at breakneck speed. That industrial base would soon become crucial when Adolf Hitler turned his armies toward the Soviet Union. During World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States became unlikely allies against Nazi Germany, but their experiences of the war couldn't have been more different. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 20 to 27 million people, soldiers and civilians. Cities were destroyed, entire regions were burned to the ground. The US lost around 400,000. That's still tragic, but it's a different scale. During the war, the US shipped tanks, trucks, planes, and food to the Soviets under Lend-Lease. The Soviets provided manpower and endured the bloodiest front of the war in Europe. If you learned in school that America and Britain defeated Hitler with some help from the USSR, remember that in the Soviet story, it sounds more like, "Without our sacrifice, you wouldn't be here to watch this video." As soon as the Nazis were defeated, the alliance between Washington and Moscow began to crumble. They had different visions for the post-war world. The United States wanted democracies and open markets. The Soviets wanted friendly, communist-aligned governments on their borders. The result was a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. No direct battles between US and Soviet armies, but constant competition in politics, technology, economics, and weapons. The world split into two main camps. On one side, the United States and its allies in NATO. On the other, the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe, grouped in the Warsaw Pact. But this split was about more than armies. It went down into people's everyday dreams. In the US, you had the classic American dream, A house in the suburbs, cars in the driveway, supermarkets packed with choices, and the idea that with hard work you could move up. In the Soviet Union, the promise was different. Your education would be free, your healthcare would be free, your job would be guaranteed, and you wouldn't be left to starve or live on the street. In exchange, though, you accepted far less freedom over your speech, your media, your travel, and your political choices. Behind all of this was one shared nightmare: nuclear war. The US developed the atomic bomb first and used it on Japan. The Soviets built their own bomb not long after. Then came hydrogen bombs that were even more powerful, long-range missiles that could cross continents, and submarines that could fire nuclear warheads from under the sea. Both countries built enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over, and they sat pointed at each other, ready to launch in minutes if someone believed the other side had struck first. In American schools, children were taught duck and cover drills, hiding under desks in case of a nuclear blast. Deep down, everyone knew a wooden desk wasn't going to stop a fireball. On the Soviet side, kids were told that America was the imperialist enemy waiting for a chance to destroy their homeland. Each side needed the other to look like pure evil to its own population. The closest the world came to actually crossing the line into nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The US had already placed nuclear missiles in countries like Turkey within striking distance of Soviet territory. The Soviet leadership decided to respond by secretly installing their own nuclear missiles in Cuba, a small island just 90 miles from Florida. When American U-2 spy planes took photos of the missile sites, the crisis exploded. Suddenly, maps of Cuba and missile ranges were spread out on tables in the White House and the Pentagon. President John F. Kennedy sat with his advisors while they debated airstrikes, invasions, and naval blockades. In Moscow, Soviet leaders said firm messages they would not back down easily, and an attack on Cuba could mean war. For 13 days, the world held its breath. This wasn't a movie. This was real time with real consequences. One mistake, one misreading of the other side's intentions, and you and I might never have been born. In the end, both sides stepped back. Publicly, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. Quietly, the US agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey later on. The world survived, but the fear and mistrust didn't disappear. They just shifted into different arenas: the space race, the arms race, and proxy wars in places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and across Africa and Latin America. Now, what was everyday life actually like inside the Soviet Union during all of this? In American TV and movies, you often see the same images: long lines for bread, empty shelves, gray buildings, and people looking tired and hopeless. There's truth in that, especially in the later years, but it's not the whole story. Imagine a typical Soviet middle-class family. The father might be an engineer. The mother might be a doctor or a teacher. Their children go to good public schools for free. University is free or almost free. Healthcare is covered. Unemployment is rare because the state is responsible for giving you a job.
Many people had stable, predictable lives, but they paid for that stability with their freedom. You couldn't just move to any city or region you wanted. Internal passports and permits controlled your movement. Independent media criticizing the government did not exist. Openly practicing your religion could hurt their career. Listening to Western rock music, wearing jeans, or reading foreign books might attract unwanted attention from the authorities. Jokes about the leadership were whispered in kitchens, not shouted in public. At the same time, the Soviet Union made some striking achievements. It launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. It sent Yuri Gagarin, the first human, into space. It sent the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space as well. While the US was wrestling with racial segregation, the civil rights struggle, and protests over Vietnam, Soviet propaganda seized on those images and said to the world, "Look, the Americans can't even treat their own citizens equally, and they call us the bad guys?" On both sides, reality and propaganda were woven tightly together. Both systems had things to be proud of and things to be ashamed of. Both lied to protect themselves. By the 1970s, the Soviet system was clearly slowing down.
Economists call this the era of stagnation. Growth was weak, technology lagged behind the West. In a centrally planned economy, there weren't many rewards for innovation or hard work. People joked, "They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work." Consumer goods remained scarce. To get a car or a decent apartment, you often needed connections inside the Communist Party. Corruption flourished in those networks. Then, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. What they expected to be a quick operation turned into a long, bloody, and incredibly expensive war, something like their version of America's Vietnam. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died. The war drained money and morale. The United States armed Afghan fighters to bleed the Soviets. The damage from that conflict on all sides is still felt today. In the middle of these crises, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, took over. He understood that the old model was unsustainable. He introduced perestroika, an attempt to restructure the economy and make it more efficient, and glasnost, a policy of openness that allowed more free speech, more criticism, and more honest discussion of the country's problems. On paper, these reforms sounded smart and necessary, but imagine taking the lid off a pressure cooker that's been building steam for 70 years. Once people were allowed to speak more freely, many didn't just criticize small issues, they questioned the entire system. In the Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, people openly demanded independence. In Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and other republics, nationalist and democratic movements grew stronger. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed governments faced massive protests. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. That wall had stood for decades as a symbol of the divide between the communist East and the capitalist West. When it came down, it signaled something much bigger. The Soviet Empire was cracking. By 1991, the USSR formally dissolved into 15 separate independent countries. The Soviet flag was taken down over the Kremlin, and the same year that many American kids were unwrapping their first Game Boys or Super Nintendos, one of the world's two superpowers quietly ceased to exist. Now, let's return to that underground bunker and the man named Stanislav Petrov. In 1983, during a time of high tension, the Soviet early warning system reported what appeared to be a U.S. nuclear attack. According to protocol, Petrov should have immediately passed that information up the chain of command, triggering a retaliatory strike. Instead, he trusted his instincts over the computer. He judged that it was likely a false alarm. He took a risk and broke the rules. He was right. The satellite system had misread sunlight reflecting off clouds as missile launches. Think about the weight of that moment. One mid-level officer you had probably never heard of before this video made a decision that may have saved your life, your family, your city, and possibly the entire human race. He got almost no recognition at the time. His reward was a quiet, modest life, and much later, a bit of acknowledgement. But his story tells us something crucial. Even inside a system we think of as the enemy, there were human beings making moral choices in impossible situations. So, how should you see the Soviet Union now? It's too simple to call it just a villain. It was a country of immense scientific and technological achievements. It was a regime of harsh political repression. It was a project built on an ideal of equality that was constantly undermined by fear, lies, and power struggles. It was a warning about what happens when any ideology, left or right, decides it can never be wrong. You might wonder why any of this matters in an America that's focused on inflation, social media, elections, and whatever is trending today. But the shadow of the Soviet Union is still all around you. Your government's defense budget, a huge portion of your tax dollars, is still shaped by Cold War thinking, the belief that you must always be prepared for a major threat from other great powers. NATO, the military alliance originally created to contain the Soviet Union, is still expanding and shaping global politics. Modern tensions between Russia and the West have deep roots in promises and conflicts from the Soviet era. Nuclear weapons are still very much with us. The Soviet Union is gone,
but its largest successor state, Russia, still holds thousands of nuclear warheads. The United States and Russia remain the two largest nuclear powers on Earth. We are still, in a very real sense, living in the world that the US-Soviet nuclear standoff created. And every time American politicians argue about things like universal health care, free college, or student debt relief, words like socialist and communist get thrown around.
Those words feel heavy because of decades of Cold War fear and propaganda. Even though the USSR collapsed more than 30 years ago, the emotional reaction to those ideas hasn't vanished. So now, let's turn this from history into a personal question for you. Imagine you weren't born in Los Angeles, Chicago, or Miami, but in Moscow or Kyiv in 1965. You grow up in a system where your education is free from first grade through college. Healthcare is guaranteed. You don't have to worry about losing your job and health insurance if you get sick. Housing is basic, but you're not going to be homeless. You get some paid vacation time, maybe a trip to the Black Sea with friends or family. Life is not luxurious, but it is stable and predictable. At the same time, you can't just say whatever you want about the government. There's no Google, no open internet, no free press. You don't get to choose between multiple political parties with real power. You can't simply watch any news channel you want and expect it to be uncensored. If you tell the wrong joke about the country's leader in front of the wrong person, you could be reported. Doors can close quietly in your career. In the worst case, you could face interrogation, prison, or worse. So here's the question I want you to really think about. Would you feel comfortable in that system? Would you accept limited freedom in exchange for guaranteed basics, education, healthcare, a job, and a certain kind of security? Or would you eventually decide that no amount of free services is worth living with that level of control, and you'd be out in the streets with thousands of others demanding the right to speak freely, to criticize, to choose, even if it meant economic chaos, uncertainty, and risk? I want you to answer that in the comments. Tell me which state you're watching from, and whether you think you could have lived inside the Soviet Union, or whether you would have ended up protesting it. If this story made you see the Soviet Union as more than just a one-dimensional villain, if it made you think about freedom, security, and power in a new way, then hit like so more people get to see it. Share this with a friend who always says history is boring, and let's see if they still think that after almost watching the world end by accident in 1983. And if you want more deep cinematic dives into the real history that shaped your life without you even noticing, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Because this journey isn't over. Next time, we're going underground into the real spy war between the CIA and the KGB, double agents, secret tunnels, assassination plots, and the covert operations that never made it into your school textbooks. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.